Good afternoon. This lesson's all about Stalin's purges, the Great Terror. What is a purge? Well, a purge, in its strictest definition, means a removal. So in Stalin's term, the Great Terror was the removal of his political enemies. Now this part of the lesson just looks at how he removed political enemies. The second part will look how the Great Terror affected the rest of the population of the Soviet Union. We need to understand Stalin was paranoid. He saw enemies everywhere. Every mistake that was made in his mind was due to betrayal and treachery. After the power struggle, there were still many people around Stalin who disagreed with his policies. One primary example is Bukharin, who disagreed with many of Stalin's policies. Stalin had Bukharin arrested by the secret police. Bukharin was then tortured by the secret police, and this man here, the short man here next to Stalin, Yagoda, he was tortured until he confessed that he had betrayed the Soviet Union and Stalin. Of course he hadn't, but he'd been tortured, and so the confession was false. He was then put on trial publicly, where he repeated his confession to the world's media. Now you may think, what was the point of doing all this? Why didn't he just take him outside and kill him? For Stalin's paranoid mind, this wasn't enough. He had to have the confession so he could prove to the world that he was right. Why else would someone confess to a crime they didn't commit? Of course, Bukharin and thousands of people like him were told that if he didn't confess, his family would be killed. The people in charge of this were Yagoda, the little man here, who Stalin referred to as his little blackberry. He was a sadist, and he liked to get involved in the tortures that went on. Of course, later on, Stalin became paranoid of Yagoda and had him tortured and killed. The next man in charge, this charming-looking man here, Beria, was very much like Stalin. He was a bureaucrat, good with paperwork. But in his spare time, he liked to go down into the dungeons and involve himself in the torture, or French wrestling, as they called it jokingly. And when he was finished work, he liked nothing better to do than to have his men kidnap young teenage girls who he would then rape and strangle. Stalin needed an excuse to start killing these people. And so he took his friend, Kirov, who was very, very popular in the party. Almost too popular. Stalin feared that Kirov, who was a brilliant speaker, well-liked, handsome man, might attempt to take over from him. And so he probably had him executed. One night, Kirov was shot by a man who claimed that Kirov was having an affair with his wife. Stalin used this as an excuse to launch the purge and started arresting anyone who he felt was involved, sending them to the secret police to be tortured, then confess. Stalin also feared the Red Army. He felt that the generals at any point could take over the country and remove him, and so he launched a purge against the Red Army. He had 50% of all the officers executed, of course, after they had confessed to being traitors, which they weren't. So what impact did these purges have on politics in Russia, the Soviet Union? Well, it was twofold. Firstly, by removing anyone who disagreed with him, Stalin was just surrounded by yes-men, like Beria, who would just do as they were told. This was good for Stalin, but it meant that he was living in a dream world, with no one to tell him that his policies may need correcting. To the Red Army, well, it's obvious. Killing 50% of your officers means that your armed forces are severely weakened, which came true when the Germans invaded in 1941. So, because of his paranoia, he actually made the Soviet Union a weaker place.